a little bit about what we have going on in this battlefield. This is going to be the Battle of Princeton. It's going to be fought on January 3rd, but some of it begins the night prior, and so that's why it says 2nd through the 3rd. It's going to be fought in New Jersey. And one of the things to know about this battle is, this is, like I mentioned, part of 10 very important days during the American Revolution. And the first part of it is going to start, like we mentioned, with George Washington's crossing of the Delaware. And that's a pretty big deal. It's going to anger not only the Hessians, but also the British under Cornwallis. And so Cornwallis is going to come from way up here, and he's going to march in this direction. And the reason he's going to march in this direction is he wants to take on George Washington. He wants to eliminate this threat. As we mentioned before, probably really frustrated that this is in the winter, and why are people fighting in the winter? And so he's going to head down south. What George Washington is going to do, interestingly enough, is he is going to re-invade Trenton after he had initially crossed the Delaware. He's going to come in again and cross. And what's important about this is eventually he's going to be facing, with his about 6,000 troops, he's going to be facing a grand total of about 10,000 British soldiers. And the British soldiers are well trained, they are veterans, and they're good, and they're well led. The Americans are a mixed bag. Again, some of the Americans are militia. You never knew how some of them were going to behave under fire, and they're not particularly battle-tested yet, some of them. And then you're going to have the Continentals. And the Continentals were an attempt by the Americans to create a professional army. That's what George Washington really, really wanted. All right? So what you're going to see is a situation whereby the Americans are going to be here. Eventually, Cornwallis is going to show up at Trenton on this side of the river. And originally the Americans were on this side of the river when Cornwallis arrives. Cornwallis arrives, the Americans fight a delaying action, meaning basically they're shooting and backing up. They're just trying to slow down the much larger numbers of British, because in a full-scale battle where George Washington can't control the battlefield or the choice of the battlefield, he's going to lose against the British regulars. They are really good soldiers. And so what Washington does is he moves his troop back across a couple of bridges. This is important, because if you have a river here and you control the bridges, those are the only points you really have to defend. So a smaller number of soldiers can defend a small point against a larger number of attacking soldiers. It's kind of like if a whole bunch of ninjas tried to come through that doorway right now. We don't have to worry about that corner of the room, unless they're ninjas, because then they could be here right now and we wouldn't even know. But if they're coming in, we only have to worry about that door. That's it. And that's what Washington was doing. This was a brilliant move. He was using his smaller number of forces, and he was concentrating them in areas against the British where they couldn't use all of their numbers. Also, the British couldn't get around to flank. There's water here, there's water here. Flanking is attacking on the sides. So Washington fights a delaying action. He stops the British. They can't get him. This actually happens to be January 2nd. Washington stays at the bridges, and he tells his men, he's encouraging his men, many of whom their enlistments are almost up. They're almost ready to go home, and he's telling them, listen guys, you're fighting for America, you're fighting for your homes, right? Please stay on. He's trying to get them to keep fighting because they could just go home, right? And if you're scared, maybe that's a good idea. So what Washington is doing, he's at that bridge really attempting to get his soldiers to fight and stay, and they do. and they situate themselves at night here. The British under Cornwallis attempt on 3 times to make it across these bridges. 3 separate assaults, and the Americans stopped them. And the British soldiers lost about 365 men attempting to do this. The Americans lost about 100. Right? The Americans were defending, and the British were attacking. Usually the attacking forces lose more men. That's just the way it was. Nightfall is coming, and here's the deal. Arthur St. Clair, who was an American brigadier general, he came up with a plan. And he came up with a plan because the commander of the militia, a guy whose name was really hard to pronounce, Cadwallader, this guy was the militia leader. He knew the territory. They got together, they talked, and they came up with a plan. And looking at this, what do you think that plan might have been? Just looking at this map, is there anything you could see? Because here's the deal. Cornwallis is coming over in the morning, and he's going to attack and kill the Americans. He's just got the numbers. What can George Washington do to stop that from happening? Yeah?
Maybe he could try to flank them and go around the other way to the right.
Which, go around to the right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can't go to the left. There's water. But maybe, just maybe, you could go to the right, because there is a way to get there. The other issue is, nice job, the other issue is the militia captain said, hey, guess what? Not only could we do this, and they could conceivably do this and turn the flank, but there's still a problem with that. There's too many of these guys. Right here there's 8,000 and there's 6,000. Washington only has 6,000. Cornwallis has left 1,200 guys here and some guys here. So what happens if these guys join here and the Americans come here? Then they're going to be fighting maybe too many people. Yeah, what else might happen?
Yeah. They can get like flanked.
Yes! Yeah. If the Americans are here, boom. You don't want that to happen. So that's why there was a little road, a little known road that went this way to Princeton. Now Princeton wasn't originally the target, but Washington's like, wait a minute. If I retreat, which is probably the smart thing to do so I don't get annihilated, but if I can retreat, I live to fight another day. I've had some victories, things should be fine. The problem is, people will quit the army. Enlistments are almost up. People will lose faith in Washington as a commander if he runs away. He's got the enemy. So he's like, I've got to pull out a victory somehow here, and I also don't want to look like I'm running away. And he came up with a cool compromise. This is what St. Clair came up with. If he can, somehow, which is really difficult, get himself to this road, go here and flank like you said, but then take that little route, he can go to Princeton, which only has 1,200 soldiers that are enemies. About 6,000 versus 1,200, Washington should be able to win that battle, right? Yeah. And so then he's away from the bulk of the bad guys, and he wins another battle. Then he can go to winter quarters, right, in Morristown, which was which is really where he wanted to go. Yeah.
If there was 6,000 people like right by the river, how would they like get over to Princeton without someone noticing?
Seriously, how is this even going to be possible? A couple of things: a ruse, a trick. This is what Washington did. Let me show you. He had a whole bunch of fires set up. When it's cold, of course you're going to have soldiers with fires. He built a whole bunch of fires between himself and the British. And then he forced 500 of his guys to stay there with shovels and pickaxes, and their job was just to randomly dig in the ground. What it sounded like was that Washington was digging in. He was digging trenches. So he was staying there to fight. And the fires led the British to believe that they were still there. Whereas in reality, there's only 500 guys are going to be here, and Washington is going to extricate his troops in a very brilliant maneuver. And they headed to the road here, and then they went this way, and then, I'll just do it like this because it's easier, they started to move toward Princeton. That is a brilliant maneuver. The funny thing is, while this was going on, Cornwallis was actually heard to say, "We've got the old fox safe now. We will go over and bag him in the morning." Even though some of his officers are like, "We should really try to attack George Washington now while he's there. What if he runs away?" Cornwallis says, "Look, you can hear him, you can see him, no worries." It's about-ish 12 miles to get there. You got to move an entire army with cannon, walking silently. So what they did is they wrapped the wagon wheels of their wagons in cloth so it didn't bang against the rocks. And they were ordered to be quiet. And they left and they went this way and headed this way. But as dawn approached, they hadn't made it to Princeton yet. They were in the open road. What's strange is Cornwallis knew the battle was going to be here, so he asked Colonel Mawhood to take 1,200 of his men and meet him here. So a lot of these guys, well, about 500 of the 1,200, some of his men to meet here. He's going to leave half of them in Princeton. Not a large number at all. So if Washington can make it to Princeton, it's almost defenseless. Mawhood is traveling this way, and all of a sudden they look across and they hit some areas of fields. And there's some hills here, there's an orchard here. When they see clearings, the British are walking and they look, and they've got cannon with them and everything, and they see the Americans. And they're like, "Oh, the Americans are supposed to be here, but they're here." And so Colonel Mawhood does what he should do. By the time he sees them, he's actually here, and he sees them. So he rushes his troops back this way, and then he forms his troops here. It would actually be a slightly smaller group, because there were fewer of them than there were of the Americans, substantially. All right. The Americans are in multiple groups heading towards Princeton. Right? So a smaller section of British troops form themselves in an orchard here. The Americans see the British. And it's like, "Oh crap, we've got to take them on now." So a group of the Americans under Mercer go over this hill, and they get themselves behind a picket fence as the British open fire from the orchard. So here is bang, bang, bang. The shooting really commences at this point. This is a pretty big deal. Now, what do you do if you're George Washington? George Washington is up at the front. What do you do in this situation if you're Washington? Yeah.
Go to Princeton?
Yeah, George Washington could take his troops and take Princeton and he wins. Right? Great, he could do that. The problem is, what happens if these guys defeat these Americans? Then they can swing up and it could be a problem. Plus, that's a substantial portion of his army. And he can't let them be destroyed. So what happens is this. These guys are engaging the British. It's a hard-fought battle. Boom. Mercer, he's a brigadier general. Mercer is hit. And then the British start to swarm the Americans, and they use a bayonet charge. The Americans are shooting, and then they see the British charging with bayonets. Again, some of the Americans don't have bayonets, and they start to falter. The British are winning. Even though there's fewer British, they're winning, and they start to knock the Americans back. They take Mercer. They find him, they start to stab him with their bayonets. Why are they so mean to this guy? They think it's George Washington. He's dressed beautifully, he's got a sword, he's obviously an officer. They think it's George Washington. They mock him brutally, and they stab him repeatedly. As a matter of fact, it was yesterday. Yesterday was the anniversary of Mercer's death. He did not die on the battlefield, he died a couple of days later. Right? 13 bayonet wounds. He was stabbed 13 times. He survived for a short amount of time. They thought they got George Washington. The American troops freak out, and they fall back behind this hill. Some of the Americans sweep in, and they bring cannon with them. That should help. And it does, temporarily. But Mawhood's men are tenacious, and they're not giving up. So they're here. Still a smaller number than the Americans. These 4-pounders that the Americans brought in make a difference, but it's not enough. These guys are going to falter. These guys are going to run. What does George Washington do?
He runs it down.
Yes. What George Washington does is brilliant, and he had to do this. George Washington swings his troops around, and then leading his command, he is going to, like from the front, on supposedly a beautiful white charger, with his hat in his hand, he is going to rally his troops. And what he's going to say to them is he's going to say, "Parade with us, my brave fellows. We shall have them directly." And so he puts himself in harm's way. He rallies the troops. The American soldiers who were running away now turn. And they're like, "That's George freaking Washington." And they ran with him back to face the enemy. And there were then reserve troops coming in to save the day. George Washington apparently got 30 yards away from the enemy. They formed up in lines. Both sides formed up in lines. And George Washington stopped his men when they got 30 yards away. He ordered them to halt, and then he ordered them to fire a devastating volley into the British. It was so crazy that apparently there were also American officers who were there. And one guy covered his eyes with his hat because he says, I can't bear to see George Washington killed. And so he covered his eyes. When he opened his eyes and the smoke cleared, George Washington is still on his horse, still trying to get his soldiers to fight. That was a boss move. He was so close to the enemy, and he was not hit. His troops then continued this way, and Mawhood's troops eventually flee. They leave the battlefield. What this allows then, Washington is going to reform his troops. They're going to enter Princeton. There was an attack, and there was some defense, as a matter of fact, at the university. British soldiers got themselves in a bunker-like building, and a guy that you may have heard of, Alexander Hamilton, is going to bring up some cannon. And eventually they're going to encourage the British to surrender. So those that were here surrendered. Those that were here ran off. Cornwallis is stuck down here and went, "I missed the battle," because he did. Eventually what's going to happen is Washington is then, he had a double victory here. He's going to then head north to winter quarters. Right? But the reason that this was a big deal is because these 3 battles saved the American Revolution because, don't worry, I'll get to you. They saved the American Revolution because had that not happened, the British had this aura of invincibility, that they could never be destroyed. And George Washington was picking away at that, crossing the Delaware, Second Battle of Trenton, and Princeton. He was showing that the Americans could stand toe-to-toe with one of the greatest armies in the world at the time, certainly the greatest navy. And we could stand toe-to-toe with them. And it's going to take a lot more. The British are going to realize, wow, we're really going to have to step up our efforts. And what's going to happen with George Washington is it's going to give him a little bit more ability to recruit soldiers because they're winning. It's going to give him a little bit more ability to get the Continental Congress to start giving him money to pay his troops. And every battle Washington wins gets us closer to being recognized by other European powers, like the French, who we needed as allies, or we never would have won this thing. All right, yeah, you had a question.
What happened to the 500 that were making fires?
Oh, really good question. The guys that were making the fires, their job, once it became dawn, was to run. Run and try to meet up with George Washington. Basically to get the heck out of Dodge, because if they crossed this way, you were going to be annihilated. But as it happened, that just wasn't the case. And so what you're going to see is a setup for eventually what's going to happen at the Siege of Yorktown, and we'll eventually see the end of the war. Wouldn't have happened if George Washington hadn't made some really brilliant moves, showing his bravery and intelligence here at the initial bridges, listening to his officers and a militia commander, and who told him that there was another route to make. This is a pretty impressive flanking maneuver, really. And then to personally expose himself to gunfire to rally his troops is amazing. This is true leadership. Another thing, some people said that he should have continued fighting at this point, and he should have gone after there was a war chest full of a whole bunch of money and things like that. He should have gone for that. Washington went, you know what? We've done a good job. We need a rest. And that was the smart move. So George Washington made a series of very, very brilliant decisions. That is why, friends, Frederick the Great, who was an amazing Prussian general, when asked who the greatest military commander of all time was, he could have obviously said himself. He said George Washington, because George Washington did more with little than anyone else could possibly comprehend. Pretty impressive stuff. Right? So, thank you guys for listening to that. Yay! That's the end of the battle. Ta-da! Feel free to clap. Thank you. Thank you. I like it. It's like when someone passes the line really last in cross country, and everyone's like, "Good job, good job." All right, that's what it felt like. Thank you. Love you all.